Hello, and welcome to this meeting of the Women and Gender in Socialism and Post-Socialism workshops at the Davis Center. Our topic for today is surveying gender history in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. I'm the moderator, Rochelle Goldberg-Ruthchild. I'm a center associate. And it's my honor to be moderating this panel today. I want to start by just saying that we cannot ignore the events that are going on in Ukraine. And all of us have spent time in Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. All of us have had friends in those areas, some relatives in those areas. We are deeply, deeply concerned about what's going on, and we condemn the invasion by Russia into Ukraine. And we want to say that we stand with the people of Ukraine, Slava Ukraini. We are honored to have three editors of the Routledge Handbook of Gender in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Janet Elise Johnson is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, the City University of New York. Her books include The Gender of Informal Politics, 2018, Gender Violence in Russia, 2009, and Living Genders After Communism, 2007, as well as the Routledge Handbook, which she co-edited with Katalin Fabian and Mara Lazda. And was published this year, actually. In the last few years, she has published articles in Post-Soviet Affairs, Russian Review, and a whole bunch of other scholarly journals, as well as online in the New Yorker, the Washington Post Monkey Cage, and the Boston Review. She recently served on the executive committee of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, our major scholarly organization, and she coordinates a monthly workshop on gender and transformation in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, which is now affiliated with the City University of New York Graduate Center. Katalin Fabian is Associate Professor of Government Law at Lafayette College. She is also an accomplished author, the author of Contemporary Women's Movements in Hungary, Globalization, Democracy, and Gender Equality, and also the editor of Globalization Perspectives from Central and Eastern Europe. Mara Lazda is Associate Professor of History at Bronx Community College, the City University of New York. Her regional focus is on Latvia, with broader research interests on the intersections between gender, nationalism, and transnationalism in historical and contemporary contexts. For example, one of her papers is Negotiating Gendered Nationalism and Transnationalism in Post-Socialist Latvia, which was published in the Nationalities Papers. So today we will be talking about the book, which Janet, Katalin, and Mara have co-edited, and I have a copy of the book. It's quite the tome. The book has 51 articles, which if you can either digest them and all at once, or you can, it's almost one article a year. You can have little morsels for a whole year of articles. It's an incredibly comprehensive work that traces the history, methodology, ideological debates, different constructions of gender, history, sociology, anthropology, in imperial and fascist, socialist, communist, and post-communist societies, and transnationalist movements. Elizabeth Wood and I are both center associates, and we both have articles in this collection, which shouldn't make it more interesting for you to read. I think all of the articles are really, really good. So with that, I turn it over to Janet, Mara, and Katalin to talk about your book and many other things.
Thank you very much for that introduction. We're really happy to be here. I do want to talk a little bit more about the context that we are living in, and that is the war. I think when we planned for this talk, we were really focusing on a celebration of the book, a celebration of collaborating with over 60 authors, and a celebration of International Women's Day on March 8th. And so the celebratory aspect is difficult in this context, but at the same time, I think I was grateful for this space, because in this time of war, when really we've I think feel a little uncentered and unstable, one of the ways in which we can try to make sense or try to contribute is turning to our colleagues of the region, as well as to what we do, to our work, and trying to see maybe not answers, but ways in which we can both try to understand what is happening, as well as communicate to our colleagues and to our students, and more broadly to the public. And so in that context, I have been thinking, we have been thinking, well, how can the handbook perhaps help us understand or inform what we're seeing today in Ukraine? And I keep returning to one of the central claims of the handbook's introduction. That is, we posit that gender is always one of the main axes around which politics, economics, and societies are organized. And in the book, we frame this kind of around the ideology of communism, that is, we say before, during, and after communism. At the same time, it's quite a big claim that even I have been thinking about. To what extent can we say that is always one of the main axes around which politics, economics, and societies are organized? But it has been striking to me the ways in which the reports out of Ukraine have been centered around gender narratives both have imposed or created externally as well as internally and by the participants. So just to kind of remind ourselves of some of these narratives that have been kind of bubbling to the surface in the very beginning, we have the gender narratives of feminist protest. And you see, so feminine, and one of the sections of our book does look at specifically at feminist movements and as feminists as activists. So we have women in Minsk and in Belarus, and the Solidarity is Our Weapon, speaking out against the war in Ukraine, as well as feminist anti-war transnational coalitions, such as the US-based Code Pink, speaking specifically in gendered ways of protesting and commenting on the war. Women have also reappeared or become more prominent as the face of protest in Russia against war. Just two images that have become familiar. One of which is feminist organizations, feminist leaders leading the protests in Pushkin Square. But also, I think most of us have probably seen the last few days. It's become a very popularly shared image of Yelena Osipova, the 77-year-old woman who also has come out as kind of a connection to World War II and to resistance. But again, these protesters have risen to attention because of their gender. In addition to protests, women have also become the face of war as participants of war in military. So this has become, we should note, this is not just in 2022, but also since 2014. And one of the most famous, against more shared, is the Ukrainian MP, Kira Rudik, who recently posted how she has grabbed a Kalashnikov and is learning how to participate directly. So I share that just in terms of thinking about how, this was one of the goals of the handbook, to both document these narratives as well as critique them and think about how they have if they have, in fact, shaped the way that we understand the region, as well as understand the powers of regimes of communism, Nazism, and post-communism throughout the history of this region. So let me turn now directly to the handbook itself, as well as what is a handbook. So we ourselves had to learn what a handbook was when we started on this project. And through consultation with our colleagues, we quickly learned that there's several audiences that we have for this book. One is for established scholars in the region, and those are also the contributors to the book. But it also is kind of a guide to the region for those who perhaps have some kind of academic background, but don't know much about the region itself, or are developing a new project in the region. So the audience is both specialists as well as broader for perhaps advanced graduate students or advanced undergraduate students or policymakers or those interested in the region. So the handbook is divided into 6 parts. I will read all of those for you. You can see, you can read those for yourselves. And what is striking here is we try to, or rather I should say, the handbook itself is designed to be read both as a whole, as was said in the introduction, but also as individual parts and coherent chapters, so that each part also has its own introduction. And the chapters can be read again individually in each section or across sections. The book has over 50 chapters, and with a wide range of topics: sexuality and moral panics, women peasants, Bolshevik feminism, going from the early 20th century into the 21st century. What unites all of these chapters is thinking about their engagement with different, what we call gender regimes, different political regimes, ranging from empire, nationalism, fascism, Stalinism, socialism, communism, and post-communism. Now, the project itself, one of the most rewarding aspects of the project, as well as perhaps one of the most challenging, was its interdisciplinarity. So even as individual scholars, we wear many of these hats. We are scholars of the region, of gender studies, but we're also quite grounded in our own disciplinary specialties of history, political science, sociology, anthropology, as well as other inter and transdisciplinary fields, such as disability studies, social work, legal studies, peace studies, and public health. And this has been one of the most exciting aspects of learning from this project, is working with these scholars that are coming from many disciplines and finding both commonalities and ways in which we are very well grounded in our disciplines and trying to find a common language. So in my concluding comments in my section, what I'd like to do is reflect a little bit on how working on the project and on these chapters has made me think and rethink my own role, my own identity, my own work as a historian, and thinking also about the title of this workshop, kind of the gendered history of the region. What does the handbook say about gendered history of the region and its development in the last decades? So I want to just kind of think about gendered history as from 2 perspectives. One is gendered history as a methodology. In the handbook, Anna Krylova writes that the mission of feminist scholars in the late 1990s to bring gender into the historiographies of Russia and Central-Eastern Europe and Eurasia has been accomplished. So on the one hand, we can point to a wide range of literature, a wide range of scholarship that has incorporated gender into history. But as Krylova argues, not with the revolutionizing results that were intended with this incorporation of gender. This is something that Janet's going to return to in her part of the presentation. But the challenge that Krylova Krylova makes for us to not only document history from a gender perspective and document the role of women and men and sexualities is something that we see as a challenge, as something that is an ongoing project, an ongoing task, even after the publication of this handbook. Now, the other striking lesson that I took from working on this handbook was the significance of the history of the gender lived experience in expanding the scholarship of the region. Now, when we mean gender, we do mean, of course, men and women, femininities and masculinities. Now, but for the purposes of just my comments now, I'm going to really focus on women and femininities. Now, in the handbook, we have a separate section that is focused on the lived experience itself. In this handbook, this section is a wide historical coverage from the late imperial Russia to the late Soviet period and the post-Soviet period. So on the one hand, how the gender lived experience appears in the handbook is by documenting the experience itself. That is, for example, in Alice Weinreb and her chapter on examining the gender dynamics of common eating establishments in the German Democratic Republic, looks at how just the daily experience of preparing food, consuming food, interacted with the ideology of the German Democratic Republic. However, another aspect of gender lived experience is also the methodology of everyday life as resistance. So in their chapters, Dovila Budrita and Anna Haikova document how the history of everyday life not only is a form of exposing and documenting the agency of women in extreme situations, but the very act of, by the historian, of documenting these experiences is itself an act of resistance. And so, especially Dovila Budrita argues that the documenting of the experience of women in the Gulag and in the deportation processes played a role in the democratization and in the resistance to dictatorship, to the communist regime in the late 1980s and the late 1990s. Now, just the final comment I will make then is, even though we have sectioned off the lived experience of the individual regimes in part 4 of the handbook, one of the ways in which we can think about using the handbook is also using the experience of everyday life as well and the lived experience, reading across the sections. So 2 chapters that I highlight, Ruth's Child is the first All-Russian Women's Congress, and Wood's Paradoxes of Gender in Soviet Communist Party sections may not officially count as documenting the lived experience, but we see in each of these sections that central to developing scholarship in Central-Eastern Europe and Eurasia on gender means documenting lived experiences and the lived experiences of women. So with that, I will turn it over to Katalin.
Thank you. And you'll be my guide, meaning if you show the links hopefully accurately. This is really an enormous opportunity for us. So thank you for allowing to be here and talking with you and again with each other. But indeed, as times have changed, this whole work has taken on new meanings, just like in the past, hopefully in the future as well. So I'm going to bring some of the most important synergistic analytical tools which came out from this collaboration with many of the authors of the chapters, but also which enhanced our own individual and scholarly learning. And I will add one more item, which came this morning from a friend of mine whom I studied together from Ukraine, to bring some of these pieces together with the analytical tools as scholarly experience, but also as a very lived experience, and how the two connect together. So some of the main themes, but one of them you already see, is questioning the established categories and realizing that there are a lot of continuities across these buckets or frameworks. We have thought, at least for a long time, and the we meaning many people both in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, all over the world, that in 1989 there was a break with the dictatorial processes of controlling populations, controlling by force, eliminating opposing voices, and literally the weapon of the gun, and elimination of individual choices of any sort. This is where we are now. These are not just competitive authoritarian systems, but we are seeing emerge and shaking hands in a remake of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. But between China, there has been intelligence exchange back and forth, also a non-aggression pact. So we may see this is the same as the past, but they're not exactly the same. So what we are recognizing that some of the tools have traveled. There have been critical junctures. We have seen the Soviet Union and China during the early communist period also shaking hands, but then departing. Now, I'm not sure this is going to happen. They have a vested interest again to be cooperating together. And that is a particular interpretation of what the rule of a centralized force, maybe not in the name of a communist ideology, but still a created narrative, what they try to share or sell all across the world. And I want to bring a term from IR, international relations. Alexander Wendt, who is one of the most well-known authors of constructivist theory, has said that anarchy is what states make out of it. It sounds pretty strange, but if we go deeper, is again, depending on which position you are, you make anarchy, meaning the lack of central power in world affairs, whatever way it would work for you. You could abuse it, you could use it, whatever states make out of it. Now, in a bit of a twist, but in a parallel here, I want to use the same thing with history. History is what we make out of it. Different power positions interpret these terms, which have been used in a now many long history of enhancing human rights and choices of individuals on their own venue. Russia started this war arguing that this is genocide. And without using the international context, because it had no data, it argued to its own population that this is the last and necessary option for it to do. So it's not exactly replaying what has been done in the past, using some of the contemporary tools from trolls, Twitters, RT, Russian television, and many others to enhance this view and literally frame its own population to believe what the government does for its own protection. So these would be harking back to what we think is the 1648 era in Europe, the pre-Westphalian order, where the notion of sovereignty has been established. Let it be as oppressive as monarchies, which then led with the end of World War I, again in histories, clear dividing lines to the what appears as the new states in Central and Eastern Europe. That kind of cordon sanitaire which takes place towards the then emerging Soviet Union, which is forged in civil war. When Putin refers to Lenin saying he created Ukraine, he's not correct. He's again not looking at much of the earlier history, but he's creating a narrative which then applies for today. Lenin was a hero in every single village center and council location, every school I attended while in Hungary. But he is also the image which fell precipitously with the 1989 breakage of what we called post-communism. And these breaks, what we are learning, are connected so deeply, not just with what important men in history are claimed to do, but also what women feel compelled and feel also supported to do: resist or go with this flow. This is how and why this war is such a, again, important point for us to reflect how to learn from the past. So when we think about how Putin can be stopped now, and the White House thinking how we would not anger him anymore, this is not just the now, but the long-term structural development which has led here. You can't stop Hitler in 1939, but you can stop him a few years earlier. So there are lessons for so many of us to think about this interconnected world. In my humble opinion, it is not the interconnected global neoliberal system which broke, and that's the problem itself. On the contrary, maybe we didn't do it well enough, which, you know, in many lessons from the League of Nations to the United Nations, there's still many lessons to learn. So one of our major lessons was that although we tend to think in these buckets spill over, the lessons come through, and often we have to look through much more carefully through the interpretations of history. Not that all flowers bloom, and that's where I will be going next, through the interdisciplinarity focus, which Mara already focused on. Mara, can I get to my lovely next slide? Did I put you in a lull? All right, so we do realize that there are lots of debates, and both past and present, I hope we will have a future. I think in debates, recognizing that positionality, individual, class, sexual identity, nationality, religion, all of it, we'll talk about those later, influences where we position ourselves in these debates. And our editorial collective asked every single presenter of these, the chapters, to engage with the debates, which for us, I think in political science may be more obvious that they exist. They're not equally true, but they're equally or possibly competitively popular. A logical fallacy can be dramatically popular, even though it has huge logical holes in it. Right? So when we look into these debates, we have rolled back and did find that even during communism, but especially with what we saw at the end of communism, we have seen 3, maybe 4 major waves of these competing perspectives. In 1990, the first debate was how could feminist theory be applied to a very different environment, going through multiple types of divisions: political, economic, cultural, social, also emerging the reinterpretation of what we thought, focusing on women, to gender contract, not just the social contract. Also asking who can theorize, who is in a position to speak the language of mostly English theoretization by that point, extensive one. What is the difference from the communist experience, which provided extensive services to women, also if symbolic but existing participation in politics, supporting what so many of us deeply struggle, some kind of a balance between work and so-called family life, which I don't know how many academics managed to achieve thus far. I'm certainly not one of them. What kind of dialogue is there without hierarchy of the supposedly winning West, the triumphant notion of neoliberal capitalism? I think these different positions are important to recognize. And certainly they have influenced all of us. We come from different positions. Again, looking at who is going to study Latvia or Hungary, or Russia as an undergraduate, which language you would learn, and then bring those perspectives to the broader, let's say, global audience who speaks English and is able to publish more broadly on this part of the world. The second major debate about activism. Here comes the notion of being the handmaidens of neoliberalism. Were these new NGOs, non-governmental organizations, promoting capitalist systems and very limited democracies? Again, the representation of women dramatically drops from even the symbolic 20-ish percentages to often single digits in Central Europe. Contemporary Russia has higher numbers than the United States. Now, I hope you see the difference, because the Duma and other so-called representative bodies are not representative in the notion as we see it, at least in the US or Western European context. And the many others, which are, I think, continuing and I think even further, are deep and powerful as we look at the war in Ukraine and its gender aspects. How do we evaluate communist era women's organizations? And how and what is the main threat to women today? For many, and you would see it in the US, imperialism broadly, and that includes, or maybe just as equally, the United States. And for many of us living through that experience of now repeated traumas from Russian aggression, is it the Russian imperialism? We will come back to the issues of decolonial, post-colonial perspectives, but I hope you see that we struggle with the legacy of these debates besides recognizing them. So let me go to the next segment, which I'm actually very proud of, although I have not done it, but I'm super proud of this image, which our colleagues have produced, the multi-dimensional gender image. So Mara, can I ask you to get there and then I come back here, all right? Right here, thank you. So this one comes from Rogozko and Volodarczyk. This is our only image added into the book. And here, what I really find fantastic is that in a very small image, we have the multiplicity and multidimensionality of what we study. We recognize the enormous power, what you have seen already on the images which Mara showed. State, with all of its powerful, oppressive capacity, police, military. We give states the legitimate power of violence, the legitimacy of using that violence. That's an ancient definition, although the state can and has also used this monopoly of violence to oppress its own population. Those are the women whom you have seen literally surrounded by either police or the military in Ukraine as well. Civil society, whose power we question and also see phenomenal advances, both during as oppressive periods as the Holocaust, often in small numbers or even in individual voices, which we see again today. And I don't know if you want me to read this letter, but let me just share parts of it, what I got from Kiev today. This is from a man, right? I'm in Kiev now with my children and my elderly sick mom. As I write this, I hear the sounds of very strong explosions not far from my apartment building. A village near Kiev, where my closest friend lives, was hit by a missile yesterday. You all know what's going on in northern and southern Ukraine. I can't find words to describe these atrocities. If the nuclear plant there had exploded, it could have obliterated all of Europe, not just Ukraine. 6 large reactors, 6 Chernobyls. The scholarly community can do little now, or perhaps it can do a lot if it can help all the world leaders to develop an effective strategy of coercion to ceasefire and peace negotiations. I can't write much now. The sirens go off all the time. So this arrived this morning. This is what says that we are connected across countries, genders. This is a guy protecting his mom. But we are still connected through the media, what is still available, and I'm very grateful for that. I know that there will be in the chat all those options to have for medical supplies, also keeping up whatever little connection internet-wise we would have with individuals. The international institutions, which you already heard me refer to the UN, especially the International Red Cross and the refugee agencies of many sorts, whom we can support individually to help people. No, I don't think 50 million people can run or ever want to run from a country what's their home. But from INGOs, NGOs, and international organizations, the few of us who can speak, who think that democracy is a valuable opportunity, I think we can use it through family and considering what the military is doing in Russia, and political parties, religion, churches of all kinds coming back to the state. We are looking at gender roles as they represent systems of difference, privilege, oppression, how adequate they are today, and as they affect us all, men, women, and everything in between. So if you let me come back to those de- and post-coloniality slides. I know I'm going a little bit, and I will finish with this slide, promise. All right, I think I had the decoloniality side. No, it went to somewhere else. All right, then I'm gonna go with Central Europe. Janet, if you want me to do that, I can gladly focus on this. Mara, you showed this a few times earlier, but here we are, perfect. All right, so if we look back and use history with our interdisciplinary lens, and as this part of the world not just keeps changing, has changed, and that Central European part, where so many of us now focus on, have a very important lesson in this regard, both about gender and politics more broadly. We called it the region, and that region is not divided again in a very different and powerful way. We do see it as historically constructed, as you see, deeply debated, dynamic. In this case, dynamic because of a war. Previously, it was divided because of those political institutions and ideologies. What matters and what we call as the region matters to gender analysis, whom we include, whom we exclude. You will see then with the post-coloniality, decoloniality aspects, every single country in this part of the world, from Serbia to Hungary to Poland to Russia, have been in the position of victim and also perpetrator. So questioning our own compromise, and we didn't like it. We questioned it, and we will question it, I think, from here on, as we did before. What is Central and Eastern Europe, especially with Eurasia? There have been a very clear dividing lines. We included that with history during the Cold War. This was the very diverse, but somewhat also overlapping experience about the gender contract, where women got education, healthcare, maternity care, which are pretty big deals, but on a very, very low level, exactly so that their labor could serve the then communist state. There are many variations based on religion, ethnicity, race, language, and nationalisms, especially also between rural and industrializing cities. We also see lots of continuities back to those dramatic divisions we tend to think about as our intellectual buckets, as entering into the European Union, whose antechamber is NATO. In case you haven't noticed, that has been the debate about Ukraine and Georgia, and now we are looking at Moldova with the same vulnerabilities. If you're not part of the club, then you don't have the support, and this is what Russia claims to have wanted to avoid. And as our Ukrainian colleague who wrote on Ukraine, although she is stationed in the US with an American passport, staying or compelled to stay within Russia's orbit. How many choices do we have? So if we have a few minutes, I will go back to the issues of ambiguities, which is our next theme, which we wanted to share with you. We want you to at least think about this. We are not making things equal in recognizing that there are different perspectives, where we come from, class, access, etc. but also seeing that there are multiple perspectives around here. So let me stop, give it to Janet, who is very eager to continue on the Russian perspective. Thank you.
Not eager to continue on the Russian perspective, but so we do have a publication coming out from the Russian Review, which is sort of ironic about all of this. But if you can move on, Mara. I find myself today as trained as a Russianist within the field of political science and specifically comparative politics, which comes out of a Cold War paradigm, kind of in a weird place, trying to figure out how to talk about these things. And I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about how the handbook might help us rethink and what we might need to do to move beyond what's in the handbook. Tim Snyder, as many of you might have heard at the lecture that he gave a couple weeks ago on Ukraine as a normal country, said that it is important not to engage directly with the myth, but that because it is your lively engagement that keeps the myth going. It is crucial to do instead to speak against history in such a way that the myth falls away or loses its central place in our imagination. As Russia invaded Ukraine using all sorts of myths to justify what it was doing, I think it's super important to kind of keep thinking about that. We spent a lot of time in the handbook and in our recent publication thinking about this question of whether women were emancipated under the Soviet communist ideology and lived experience, or the opposite, that they weren't. And that framing of that question about how did women fare under that system or this system? But I want to kind of take a step back and think about the intersection with that question with the myths about the past created and sustained by the USSR or Russia. And also, what does that mean for the post-communist period? And broadly, what do we, and I'm just speaking as one US-born Russianist, what responsibility we have in this project? If you can go ahead. So one of the chapters in the book that Mara discussed is by Anna Krylova, and she specifically calls us to interrogate Cold War paradigms. And as I reread this the last couple of days, I mean, I think her framing is about a US Cold War paradigm, which she sees as historiography rejecting the idea that socialism actually emancipated women. And she has a deeper critique about the gender binary that we could go into and think about. But here I think that's a US Cold War paradigm. And that's an interesting thing to reflect upon when the old left in the United States is unable to see what Russia is doing as violence and tends to worry more about what the US is going to do in response. I think that I want to push back to Krylova's chapter and say, and we'll ask actually, does the handbook provide alternative frameworks and perspectives from across the region in order to suggest paths to diversifying knowledge production beyond these Cold War paradigms? Mara, thank you. So I just went back and kind of looked. We certainly did not overcome the fact that most of the literature or scholarship on the region or much of it has been Russian-centered. 14 out of 51 of our handbook chapters are on Russia or by Russianists. I didn't do systematic analysis. This is my guess, but that's less than 10%. It's not, terrible. If you go ahead, thank you, Mara. I think the biggest way, and that Cataline was hinting at, that we try to move beyond and get to a new perspective, both in terms of getting beyond the Cold War paradigm, but also getting beyond the myths of Russia and the Soviet Union, is to consider a de or post-colonial lens. So one of the chapters by Tatiana Zherko and Jenny Suchlin makes the argument that I think many of us now heard, right, that Soviet modernity was an imperial formation, even though it said that it wasn't. It was that it was not just an alternative to capitalist and Western modernity. And you can see this really explicitly in the Soviet campaigns to, quote, emancipate women that served as tools of domination in which ethnic, religious, and culturally backward others were subject to the civilizing message of the Russian and Soviet state. And we can talk about new kinds of colonialism, whether it's the EU or the United States, but this lens really helps the myth of Soviet modernity as an anti-imperial agent fall away. Alex Herzog in the handbook makes a kind of more a really radical argument, and one that we struggled with when she was working on her chapter, that even understanding basically everything that was going on in Ukraine required understanding this colonial lens. And I think really seeing Ukraine as a place that was colonized begins to challenge us even further. There's a way in which thinking about the Caucasus and Central Asia as colonized makes a lot of sense to us because they're the non-white by the whites, but here you have Ukraine as not a culturally backward place that was, and I think in some ways by the Soviet Union, I mean, certainly oppressed, but maybe colonized as well. And so she looks at both the Soviet legacies or the Soviet dominance over Ukraine, but also the influence and intervention of Russia over the last 30 years in Ukraine as being constitutive to how even the issues of such as violence against women are handled in Ukraine. I then look at the chapters that specifically take on the question of Soviet ideology and this question of women's emancipation. There are 3 chapters. I'm just going to go quickly because I recognize we're over time. The chapter that I think does this most explicitly, who takes the question of women's emancipation most explicitly head on, is the chapter by Elizabeth Wood, and comes to the conclusion that perhaps in the end it is unfair, I'm quoting her, to raise the question of the GNRDL effectiveness as either emancipatory or instrumentalist exploitation for the purposes of building party loyalty and control. So she comes to this kind of ambivalent answer to this question as well, and that's a way of getting behind the myth, right, is to make these judgments and then kind of refuse to make those judgments. We also have a lot of chapters that shift perspective. We have a chapter by Yulia Gradskova that takes on the project of, quote, emancipation in Central Eurasia most directly, but the one that I think influenced me most is the chapter by Esther Varsa. And just to take an example, we tend to talk about post-Soviet, post-Stalinist liberalization, or the thaw, as being one in which there was greater gender equality because they re-legalized abortion earlier than in many other countries around the world. And what she points out is that at the same time that they were promoting this kind of voluntary pronatalism for many folks, they were simultaneously encouraging only selective pronatalism for certain populations and also anti-natalist efforts for the Gypsies or the Roma. And that shifts the way that we tend to think about both our periodization and also the answer to this question of whether Soviet ideology helped emancipate. There are other chapters we could talk about, Gapvaz and Simic, which I think actually don't really challenge some of the myths about emancipation, but maybe I'm not sure. If we can look at the next slide, just quickly to move on to the post-Soviet chapters, there are a couple chapters that I think help us rethink Russia's position in all this by deterritorializing Russia. So Alexander Novitskaya has a chapter looking at those forced out of the former Soviet Union into places elsewhere. He both decenters gender by looking at LGBTQ activists and gender as it's connected, but thinking about what it means when we have all these migrants around the world from this region and how Russia exists now beyond the region. Similarly, Alexia Block looks at post-Soviet migration of women to places like Turkey and complicates our notion of gendered agency, but similarly deterritorializing Russia. The chapters by my colleagues most like me, meaning that they are political scientists who focus on Russia, there are 2 chapters that look specifically at methodology. So according to social science methods, our idea is that using methods help us get beyond the confirmation bias and helps us see things differently because we're so methodologically rigorous. But as I'm reflecting on my own work, and I'll speak about my own work now, I really wonder about the consequences of our methodological choices, and that in fact, by focusing on Russia even methodologically, if we go back to Tim Snyder's sort of argument about, he said, you know, if we start with this notion of on something, it means that we accept it as true. When we write on Russia, we're inherently accepting it as true. But I think as comparative political scientists, we're also sort of assuming that it's a quote nation state and not an actively imperializing or warmongering state. Like implicitly, that might be part of what we're doing as Russianist and political scientists, which seems something we need to think about. Just to finish, my last slide is that I do think that that it's important to think about feminist voices across divides. And we have this chapter by Jessica Zikovich and Natalia Termacek, which looks at Pussy Riot and Femin. And I had a lot of trouble with this chapter because I'm so focused on nation states, and their chapter really situates these two forms of activism, both Femin and Pussy Riot, as existing intersection with each other, but also within this global context. And I guess I would say that these kinds of feminisms that were seen as extremist and then maybe inauthentic by other groups challenge maybe older ideas about feminism and also challenge this discussion around women's emancipation. I actually have one more slide and I'll finish, which is, I would like to say something a little optimistic, which is that feminism in the midst of all this seems to have created a space for critique of the Russian myths that are being offered by the current Putin regime. And so we have had a really strong statement from a feminist movement in Russia. Both of these movements actually are deterritorialized, with the leading spokesperson for the Russian feminist anti-war resistance not being in Russia because it's not safe, but taking really strong stands, whether it's Pussy Riot or this feminist anti-war resistance against the propaganda of the Russian regime and against the war. And that I think it is important that feminism creates in itself that questioning of Russia's place in the world.
Thank you for this really great and comprehensive survey of your book. I really urge our watchers to get the book, to read the chapters and see how this summary really is but the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the wonderful material that's in the book. We have a couple of questions from our video audience. And also I want to say, I just learned a new word today, which is Padlet. And we will be posting a Padlet, which has links to various organizations and groups that can be supported in terms of helping and supporting Ukraine during this horrible time. So one of the questions we have for the three panelists is, can you talk somewhat about the different images of masculinity that are represented by Vladimir Putin on one hand and Volodymyr Zelensky on the other hand, in the narrative about, in the contemporary narrative and what's going on now? Yeah. Katalin.
Jenna, did I see your hand? Not yet? Okay. I just pulled an image. Can I share? Maybe? We'll try. We'll see if it works. Yes. All right. We'll see. All right. Some of my favorite images, Jonathan Mara certainly know, at least the one on the left. All right. So many of the images are clearly gendered, even if we don't use this framework, but maybe some of us are more sensitive to that. On the right-hand side is one of the more recent protests, again, evoking images when Russian women were protesting against the war in Afghanistan. But this is just a few days ago, where I think those incredibly courageous few, in this case, women without guns, at least talking back against their own police force in Moscow. The other one you would see is the women's revolution in Belarus. What both of the locations are facing is extreme oppression of not just women's voices, but any opposing voices. And this term, which I found borderline prophetic from Thomas Friedman, 2 days before the invasion, he had labeled one of his op-eds in the New York Times, thinking to paraphrase Putin, "If you do not marry me, I'll kill you." Again, a male prerogative, not every male, but we have afforded through patriarchy that men can control. So the many images which Putin and a few other political leaders, nearly exclusively men, have used is to enhance this kind of masculinity and what is associated with it, with some kind of image of holding together that military power, which again we associate with men. So there's much, much more here than just the presentation, but this is how we should behave, what we are supposed to do in our smaller and larger communities, which is why we had the notion of gender as so central to our analysis. This is a type of power, sometimes oppressive, depending on how we use those structures, and it can be also liberatory. So depending on what we use from this framework, but I trust my colleagues will have plenty more good to add here.
Well, what I wanted to, as I understood the question, is about these sort of competing images of Putin versus Zelensky. And certainly Valerie Sperling, who's also a participant of this workshop, and here I think has written about the role of those images around Putin as a kind of rationalizing force for power. And here I am kind of disturbed about my own place in all this. I'm somewhat uncomfortable with the competing images of Zelensky as, being the person who withstands the onslaught, because it's also appealing to the similar type of masculinity. And I think the masculinized portrayal of Putin has empowered him, emboldened him, created sympathy among Western populist leaders, right? They're like, oh my God, he's so powerful in ways, giving him more power and authority. And so I think that those gendered notions contribute and reify gendered notions in all of our society about who matters and who doesn't. At the second moment, or on the other hand, Zelensky is withstanding an onslaught, and so it has a different gendered meaning. I don't know. I'm not sure I can put this all together, but I do wonder about how to think about that, because I don't want to reinforce this notion of super masculinized leaders. But it is contextually very different when we have images of Zelensky when he's under, literal attack. I don't know, Mara, do you want to say something?
I think the deliberate contrast is striking, but I want to speak also to the point that you make and that Snyder makes, is recognizing, I do kind of say, our own complicity perhaps in contributing to certainly Putin's self, aggrandizing, but that certainly I think all the attention that we give to it also feeds it, right? It's there, and that might be something that we need to think about as scholars and as certainly that's something we can analyze, but how do we do it, right? Do we also, as Snyder recommends, build up a history, right, to counter the myth? But that's what I've been thinking about, because in a way we are witnessing the construction of these myths, or the engagement of this masculinization, in real time, and how we react to it is also, kind of our role and responsibility.
I'm struck by the how powerful the image is of Putin riding his horse bare-chested. It seems to me never has the act of taking off his shirt been so consequential. So along those lines, we had some other questions about women leaders of resistance, not only Pussy Riot, but also Tikhanovskaya in Belarus, the leader of Moldova, the women who have taken up positions of leadership. And along the lines of what you said, Mara, too, there is a historical, there is a history of progressive democracy in all of the countries of Eastern Europe and Russia. I wrote a little bit about it because I consider the feminist movement to be the pre-revolutionary or autonomous feminist movement to be kind of symbolic of a sort of progressive democratic alternative, which pretty much is out of the typical historical narrative, but in line with what Timothy Snyder has also talked about, having another counter narrative to the one which says that all the countries of Eastern Europe and Russia just have this tradition of authoritarianism and kind of an unchallenged narrative about that. If you could talk about that and the ways in which women often represent that alternative narrative.
Mara, ready? This is a question to you. That's why I'm not like, okay, maybe she can know the answer.
I think one result, right, when you finish a book like this is to see what you haven't done, right, or what you would do differently. And kind of reflecting on our discussions about how to structure the book. And I mean, I bring this up in the sense that, thinking most directly about which section of the book, for example, would most address this question of women as leaders and women activists. And that is, we have a section that is on women and feminist movements. And that and how we named that section in and of itself was also a debate. Like, what are we going to count as women's movements? What are we going to count as feminist movements? As far as the handbook is concerned, I mean, that's it was one of our goals is to provide this longer history and thinking about and in some ways too providing the continuity. So in some ways also unsettling the narrative or contextualizing the narrative that so much focuses on the debate about whether socialism liberated women, or whether these socialist movements actually were liberatory or not, or what the role, or were women leaders, true leaders within, if they were also within these socialist movements. And so, I mean, I think thinking from the handbook perspective, that was our goal, and kind of engaging these larger questions of going beyond these kind of maybe binary debates. And that's something that Wood's chapter in particular addresses. And I think also Rochelle's chapter also, providing this longer democratic or activist history is in a goal. I think that we made some progress in kind of unselling those debates, but also makes us more aware of the work that still needs to be done in focusing on some of these women leaders.
If I may add to this, as Mara is speaking about this, another reiteration of the usual colonial perspective, very hierarchical. Oh, that's just Eastern Europe. They just like to kill each other. That it's always happens. They're just dictatorial. They just can't help themselves. That kind of a perspective, I think, is deeply troubling, no matter who is replicating it. And also to me, and I hope for many others who have challenged this term, past dependency. If that were the case, that previous authoritarian or monarchical presence means that no democracy can ever appear, then on this basis, nothing would ever change. And if there is one constant in human history, that is change. It's never a simple path. I think this country and many others can attest to that. Chile's collapse and its long-standing democracy with the Pinochet putsch was a total shock. That was a pretty stable democracy. Same thing with Poland and Hungary, very reasonably established democracies, suddenly turning much more on the illiberal turn. Which means it's not gravity. This is not how it has to be. There are ways to do democracy better, and I think history has provided phenomenal examples on that, from the collapse of the Weimar Republic and many others. I'm not saying, oh well, we just keep trying, but the idea that, oh well, this just happens in Eastern Europe, they just tend to be dictatorial. They can't help themselves, but there are ways to get it better. I'm not saying I'm the eternal optimist, because this war is plenty horrible, but we have seen dictators fall, just like my spiritual leaders from Gandhi and many others tell me. All of the dictators fall. This one will fall too. And he is not a monarch. He's not a Tsar. Not even in Turkmenistan, the second generation of dictatorship comes in. It's all lives and all time. But it will change. I don't know if the Russian people will rise up or something else will happen, but to dig our head in the deep down ground and feel sorry for democracy is actually not, to me, the way to go. And I also think that there are many historical antecedents, women and many others who have fought for meaningful democracy, should be encouraging us to work for that, preferably in a nonviolent fashion. It should be part of democracy.
I've been thinking about, so what the two questions were, right? We have these two male leaders and the images about them, and then Mara showed some images about women and how feminist resistance and women as warriors. So like these gender images are pretty important to what we're doing, or what's going on in the world. I think that what I've been thinking a lot about since COVID is how much our unconscious shapes how we respond to the world, right? And we've been living in fear for 2 years. And so the unconsciousness is driving the bus in a lot of ways, and gender speaks more quickly to the unconscious. So it's really easy to say, okay, well, Putin is this hyper masculinized guy, so these women leaders might be the antidote, or, and then we're faced with the complexity that we're trying to offer in this handbook, or the kinds of answers that we're giving to you, which are very complicated. And I fear that the simplistic gendered imagery of women as warriors or men as heroes, that those gender images just work so more powerfully on us. And I don't really know what to do. How we're not, like, social science is never going to win out in that. Right, in terms of creating alternative narratives. So if we're trying to undermine the myth, I'm a little stuck, because undermining the myth is such a complicated process, and it's one based on scholarship and argumentation and logic and that stuff. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I'm not able to think at the same level I was 2 or 3 years ago, whether it's COVID that has, living in trauma and fear, or this last, week and a half. Anyway, I just kind of, there's all these other things, I guess, that are going on in my head as well.
Yeah, Mara. Catalin, sorry.
That's so good. We're all together, helping each other, working together, bouncing off all the time, pushing back, catching balls. So I do teach a class on Russia and East Central Europe. Let me show this image to you. And given that Janet and I always debate with the most respect for each other, may I point at Marx? May I point at Lenin? Not that I particularly want to, but please say, social thought is powerful. It can change people. There's a damn reason why the Germans smuggled Lenin and not military vehicles across to the Russian Empire. So I am willing to be powerful with our ideas and layerings. Ideas matter, myths are created and undermined. So we can challenge this. But this is what one of my students found for a discussion. And I have seen one layer and then another layer, and then now I'm seeing a 3-layer on this. This is a relatively recent, since we are doing this discussion, at least in part, for May 8th. You see this image? I was floored by it, right? This comes from a March 8th celebration, and I'm like, what did you find? And then I'm like, why are the ballerinas around the soldiers? Shouldn't be the soldiers be around the... And then one of my students said, oh no, they are in Crimea. The ballerinas are posing to cover up the soldiers. And I'm like, oh my God, they're getting their debates here, but what an image. So many layers, gives us meaning and message. Who the hell would put together ballerinas and the soldiers in the middle of a celebration for March 8th? Anyway, there's always something we can learn from our students. So ideas matter. We matter. I'm not willing to give away education. I'm so glad I'm here. I couldn't teach gender in Hungary. I'm doing it here. I'm doing it. And I hope we will all continue to do it.
Well, I think that is an incredibly powerful image that you just posted also. I mean, it's almost like instead of Swan Lake, you have Swamp Lake. But along those lines, I think one of the things that the handbook does very well is question the ways in which the Soviet Union and the Soviet experiment has been equated with modernity, and the ways in which the scholars in the handbook really argue that it's we need to look at it in terms of a different kind of imperialism and a different kind of sense of modernity. I find myself getting into debates with people who say it's all about US imperialism, as if Russian imperialism doesn't exist. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about these alternative notions of modernity, and also what you had as one of the quotes in one of your slides, that it's really all about neoliberalism, that's the real enemy. And that if you could just talk about some of the debates about complicity and who's responsible, and the ways in which gender intersect with that.
I mean, so I guess in a quiet kind of way, I'm trying to suggest that the arguments being made by Kristen Godsey and the people who have been, I think, rightly pointing out the fact that there were emancipatory accomplishments of Soviet governments are also problematic in their rejection, or their inability to see or really take seriously Russia as an imperial power, and the coercion involved and the colonialism involved and the problematic nature. So I don't just teach Russia, I teach gender around the world, and there's plenty of really important conversations in post-colonial scholars about the ways in which even, quote, emancipatory efforts, whether it was by the Brits, ended up fostering revivals of traditionalism that never existed, right? So there's this, really complicated relationship to how power operates when it is under the guise of emancipating women. And it just seems to me, I mean, I too am having these arguments with all of my colleagues who are like, well, this is about US imperialism. I'm like, well, okay, maybe, but somebody's bombing somebody else right now. Like, we can have a conversation about Iraq and Afghanistan and whether the United States should have been involved in those wars, but this is a different conversation. And the ways in which there's this easy sort of link, like, well, the US is bad, so Russia is good, so Ukraine doesn't matter. seems to be, I mean, I'm not saying that, I'm saying that's kind of what I've been seeing in some of the left-leaning press. And I think what I was trying to reflect upon today is the ways in which the women's emancipation question kind of gets linked up into these global, these Cold War histories or these Cold War myths. And I don't have a great, I don't have an answer to this, but I had something I was going to say, and now it's just slipped my mind. Oh, but what I really think that Alec Herzog's work is really interesting in a novel way, which I was trying to get at today, which is so the thing that's problematic too, right, is everyone's talking about, well, this is a modern civilized country that's being attacked and we should take it seriously. And, you know, we all care about it because this is the region that we study. But what happened in Syria, what's happened in Afghanistan are horrible too. And we didn't have the same response as a global community. And you know, I don't want to accept that myth making, right, that this is somehow worse. It is bad. I'm not trying to make an argument that it's not bad, but I really think it's interesting to begin to think about colonialism of Ukraine. And it seems to me really important to talk about the Holodomor, you know, the forced famine, which may be tantamount to genocide that happened in the 1930s in Ukraine that was facilitated by Stalin. And to think about, you know, at the same time, or a little bit earlier, but we tend to talk about this progressive moment in the 1920s around women's emancipation and liberalization of divorce and abortion. And Alex at one of the meetings a couple of years ago was like, they were starving Ukrainians, you know, pretty much at the same time. And so, yeah, they emancipated maybe some women in the cities in Russia while they were, you know, in the middle of these colonial campaigns at the same time. So we can only see certain things. There's a tunnel vision, right? That you know, that sometimes we can have around these debates. And I think we need to think about shifting our frameworks of analysis. And I'm saying this as a comparativist political scientist who tends to see the nation state as being the primary focus. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my mumbling for today.
Mara, I'm sorry, Kathleen, I'm sorry.
We look the same. I'll take her as a sister anytime.
Right, sisterhood is powerful.
While Mara is thinking, I'm going to plop in two ideas. So I think the three of us, if quietly, agreed that we want to be critical and informed, moving away from a notion that if you recognize competing perspectives, you're debilitated and you will never be able to make a choice. We can recognize what the more positive reviews of communism, some people call them revisionists based on other schools of thought, looking at much more positive interpretations. But I think the three of us were very eager to see multiple sides instead of clearly siding with that perspective, which is plenty powerful, strangely, also in Central and Eastern Europe, at least among the academic disciplines. There was, to me, at least a shocker that the biggest problem was neoliberalism. While I also understand that there are critiques, and I'm not willing to be blind for American interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, or name it, right? I'm more than willing to take that, but it doesn't mean I should not notice what Russia has tested, right? Where we are is a different scale. And while I recognize that there have been, from racist, classist, many other aspects, why the so-called international community, and I do call it so-called, it's never 100%, it's very selective who acts and why. Look at the most recent UN Assembly decision of 140 some countries and 40 others who abstained, with 4 saying no, including Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Eritrea. Phenomenal company, which is what I'm talking about. Ukraine, both from a Russian perspective, British perspective, and US perspective, have been signing its own internationally recognized border. They actually made a commitment, the 3 of them, that they will recognize that. Now, if the Syrian dictator calls in Putin's help for eliminating its own Kurdish population, and it's in Putin's best interest to do so, given that problematic but existing norm called sovereignty since 1648, there's very little one can do, which has been tested, tried. But eliminating a country which has done pretty much everything it could do, both willingly, so with 2 revolutions to move towards a more democratic environment, and it doesn't fit its more powerful nuclear capable neighbor, then it's easy to see why at least more people are seriously concerned, so to say, pissed. It's not less relevant than what happened in Syria, less relevant what happened in Georgia, or what's happening with the Uyghurs in China. But what is happening, we're questioning the very building block of the last 500 years. And yes, it has happened, but it hasn't happened for a really long time. When a country would take over another one just because it's in a border and it's using the type of force on multiple levels. I don't think I need to list all of them right now, but we are pretty all aware of, from cyber to cyber currency, Twitters to chain blocks to God knows everything you can imagine. This is just so fundamentally contradicting to what at least the last, 70 years of development was. So it is a frontal challenge to that, no matter what the narrative is from Russia. And even they try to cover it up. It's saying, oh, I'm standing up for human rights and against genocide. And oh, by the way, I'm having elections. It just happens to be not true, which is really important. I can recognize what Russia is using as its justification. Again, I'm not against a framework, but I can say, as little and tiny and vulnerable I may be, that it just happens to be not true. And it's horribly devastating for all of us. We should focus on one thing together. It's called global climate change, instead of creating more environmental and security issues. There is something humanity should do. This is not it. I hope somebody somehow will stop him.
No, I think it was the Lithuanian prime minister who said this is a combination of Kafka and Orwell, and the fact that euphemisms are being used instead of war, a special military operation. And, I think in terms of critiques of what could be called the dominant narrative at this point, we should be able to hold 2 thoughts in our heads at the same time, just as we could walk and chew gum, we should be able to at the same time, which is that, yes, there is US imperialism. Yes, the US has engaged in many questionable actions, but that does not diminish the existence also of Russian imperialism. And we have to acknowledge that. And we ought to be able to acknowledge both things at the same time. So we're getting towards the end of our time together. I really appreciate enormously your input and your putting together this book, which I know from just my interaction with you over my article involved an enormous amount of work, editorial thought, and just careful scholarship. I do have a question though, given everything that's happened and given the fact that we all recognize the book is a drop in the bucket in terms of all the scholarship and thought about gender, would you consider doing a kind of daughter of gender handbook, a gender handbook 2? I know it's probably too early to ask you that, but have you thought about that?
No.
I have been trying to convince them. We have tons of good ideas, but yes, we are, I think, like trained. In the last 10 days, I barely could exist. I think it's important what we're doing right now. And I again need to thank you. If this will be elsewhere, I hope people pay attention. I know there were a few other questions, all merit attention. And this is what we need. This is what we should do. And I do hope that despite the insane amount of work all of this have taken, this reached people. I have tried to and started to work on an anti-gender kind of movements collection. I know Janet is working on that. I know Maura is doing many similar things, but we are reaching out to many others and hopefully connecting on this aspect, so that the written part stays there, so that other people could engage with that. I never would have thought people would ever read what I write or think. So I'm eternally grateful for that.
Well, again, thank you for your contributions today and for putting together the handbook. I want to close with a couple of things. One, I want to remind people that this is our International Women's Day program for this year, and that many people may not know that International Women's Day is actually an all-American holiday, which started in the US with demonstrations in 1908, labor demonstrations in New York City by textile workers. Although International Women's Day, which was proclaimed in 1910 with suffrage as its main goal, is now a holiday that's celebrated all over the world, except in the United States for the most part. We want to honor this tradition and hopefully extend the celebrations and have them be more than ballerinas and soldiers. Do you have any final thoughts and final words before we sign off? And one thing actually I should mention, which is that part of the what symbolizes the authoritarianism in Eastern Europe now is attacks on gender studies all over Eastern and Central Europe. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit in the few minutes that we have left, but if you have any closing thoughts anyway.
I plugged into things which are traveling now. Coming back to Kristen Gotze, I think a phenomenal international comparison about women's unpaid labor all over the world. Absolutely necessary for all of us to recognize. It's not like men don't do it, right? Men have unpaid work of different kind. But everywhere, I think in that international comparison, women unfortunately have double or triple the amount. So that's utterly important. And thinking about March 8th, and also how it's even history contested. Where did it start? Was it Russia? Was it the US? But certainly what it happened, why it became even in the UN framework, because the Soviets asked the Bulgarians to plop it into the UN, and all the controversies and contradictions which that brings across and how important that is. So I plugged in the two links also. They're very different. They're not celebrating the same thing. But again, we are connected. And I really, really, really hope, I think this is the first time ever in my life, out of my free choice, I separate nation from state. States are states. Nations, very few are luckily homogeneous. They're homogeneous because of genocide most of the time. Very few exceptions. So I'm putting on this color and this color. There's a reason for that. The first time in my life. And I hold it.
And I'll just quickly say, because I know we'll be cut off in a minute, despite my negative reaction to saying writing another one. I did. This is an incredibly rewarding experience, and the point I've taken from this handbook, though, too, and to speaking about the state of gender studies, is really how this is the anti-gender movement and critique on gender studies more broadly is really global, right? It's global. We see it in the United States. We see it really on all continents. And so I think some of this transnational, we should see this transnationally.
And the anti-gender attacks and the attacks on gender studies in the region are, that attack on intellectual thought that that Catalina's intellectual thought is an important response to this, right? And I wasn't trying to suggest that it isn't, right? Like, ideas matter, and we certainly, this book has a lot of ideas in it. And I hope it proves useful to folks. In some little way, I hope our ideas help challenge these critiques that have waylaid women and seem to be helping to justify Putin's in war on Ukraine. And thanks again to the Davis Center for hosting us. This was great. I hope that someday we can actually meet in person again and in peace.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you very, very much, Janet, Mara, and Katalin, for this really great panel and our early celebration of International Women's Day. Thank you so much.